So, hi everybody, and welcome to this latest edition of Creativity Lab. I'm Darren Caveney, creator and owner of Comms 2.0, and I'll be hosting today's session with my colleague Helena Hornby. Give us a wave, Helena. It's nice to see you. Thanks for your help. And really excited that we've got Amanda Coleman, Crisis Comms expert to the stars, I think we could call you. Crisis Comms Queen, could we call you that? There's lots of names we can give you, isn't there, Amanda?
Yeah, most of them not repeatable. Yeah.
So, no, really pleased that we've got you on the session today. As always, creativity is the theme, and so we'll be good looking at how we can weave creativity into the crisis comms planning process, kind of both before, the during, and the after. So fascinated with that. I've got loads of questions for Amanda, but I don't really want to ask any of them. We're really keen to get your questions. So as Helen has put into the chat, any questions you've got for Amanda, please type them into the chat. If you could put a great big capital Q next to it at the start, that'll just be really handy, just to help. Helena's going to monitor the chat and just help her spot the questions. Equally, if you want to raise a hand and go on audio and ask the question direct, just raise the hand, and Helena's going to be managing all things chat and questions. So Creativity Lab, latest episode, and all things crisis comms. So Amanda, you've prepared a slide deck for us, haven't you? Which I've had a sneak preview of and looks great. So yeah. So that's just coming up now. Hopefully everybody can see that. I can see it my end. So I'm going to shut up and hand over to the star of the session, Amanda, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And it's really good to be here. And you've kind of done a bit of a spoiler then. Can you do creativity when you're in a crisis situation? The answer, yes. Short answer. Slightly longer answer we'll kind of go through. This is me. Some of you will know me, some of you won't. I did a number of did a lot of public sector police focused work for 2 and a bit decades, and then I now just focus on crisis comms, which is what gives me, I think, a really good opportunity to really delve into all the aspects of dealing with the crisis, preparing for it, and all these elements. And this is why sort of you start to unpick some of the things that I think we often forget when we're dealing with crisis. So I'll talk a little bit, things like evaluation, being inclusive, and creativity. So there's lots of elements, I think, that we can get in that kind of crisis situation and just forget. So this is me. And interestingly, and I always do a bit of a plug for emergency planners, which is something some years ago I would have never thought that my life would have ever involved. But I do actually, I'm the chair at the minute of the Emergency Planning Society's Comms Professional Working Group, as they call it. But please, if you don't know who your emergency planning people are, get to know them, because although they are, sorry if anybody has a family who are emergency planners, they're an odd group of people. They are very different. They have a lot of very similar things that they're trying to achieve. And I think the more that they can understand comms and comms can understand how emergency planners work, the better. So that's a little plug for that. Key bit though, creativity. Creativity is what we're all about anyway. You know, I classed it, I think, as like it's our superpower. It's what we can do. You know, it's how we build into problem solving. There's all kinds of aspects to everything that we do, really, that has creativity sort of inbuilt in it. Whether it's we're connecting with people, we're engaging, we're trying to sell something, if you're a business that's selling things, or even that kind of behavioural change piece as well. It's all kind of got creativity kind of through it. Key element for me in that sort of creative process is the 3 bits that are on the screen there: the creativity, the ideas, and feeling comfortable to have ideas and also to share ideas. And that's a challenge often when we're under pressure. I think really at the minute, we're all feeling lots of pressures from all kinds of different things. So trying to carve some space to actually give yourself some time to think things through, to look at what you want to do, to kind of, let ideas sort of develop is really, really challenging. So I get that. But what we want is the creativity bit with ideas. We need the innovation. And for me, it's critical. How can we keep evolving and looking at what we're doing? And we absolutely, I think crisis comms historically has been very, stayed the same for quite a long period of time. Social media gave it a kick up the bum, really, because of how that worked. But we have to keep looking at how we innovate it. How do we make it better? How do we improve what we're doing? And that's definitely a key part of kind of all elements of creativity. You've also got the opportunity bit. And crisis, yes, it's always got negative aspects to it, but within every crisis, and there is always an opportunity. It's whether you decide to take it, because after the crisis has happened and you've done the recovery or you're through that, you're into change, aren't you? You should be anyway. You should be looking at what's happened, what was in that situation, what might we need to change, how might we need to develop. And that for me is where you get those opportunities to change and look at what you do. It has to be said, I know the world is in chaos. I was doing some training yesterday, and we were just discussing. I had a nice trip to sunny Birmingham yesterday, and the world is in chaos. People are struggling, and I'm one of those like consultants now who comes in and talks in like this fantastic, nirvana world where everybody's got loads of time to do all these things. I get that it is really difficult. Massive pressures on everybody, but also you've got all these external issues, and we've got to kind of factor those into everything that we're doing. It was interesting to see all the Christmas campaigns that were coming out, because they've all had to take a real kind of look at the cost of living crisis and the fact that there's a war in Ukraine, and adapt accordingly. So it makes sense to understand that what's happening around you and how things are working. It doesn't mean though it needs to stop us with our ideas. It needs to stop us with the creativity. It's just about being aware of it, about being kind of aware of how you might need to adapt. Things that you may wanted to do yesterday, or you might have done a week ago, might not be appropriate today. It's budget day. You've got to kind of have that in mind. What's that going to do with the comms? So those external factors for me, I think, are really critical now more than ever. But when we talk about the stages of a crisis, I have like 5 stages really. The identification of it, the initial response, then you get into the detailed response, then you get to what I call pre-recovery and then recovery. Before the identification bit, obviously you've got all the planning elements for what might happen, but this is when the crisis actually happens. And I think what we always get focused on is that identification and the initial response, the point at which we need to say something has happened and we this is what we're doing about it. What we never really practice, think about, plan for is the detail of how that then develops, how that becomes a kind of narrative, a conversation that you take people, like a journey that you take people through so that they can understand what's happened, how they might impact them, what they might need to do. And definitely when you get to that point of recovery, it's just an element that we really don't talk about. So for me, where the creativity really comes all the way through, and it can come all the way through that. It definitely, we'll talk a little bit in a minute about planning and how it fits into planning, but then you've got how it fits into how you develop through the actual crisis and with the recovery. And for me, as I say, it's that bit of thinking time, looking at ideas and understanding what's happening. Oh dear, what's happened there? There we go. On something whizzing in my computer, I didn't know. So in the preparation element, when you're looking at you having a plan, plans are great. I always think you need that foundation, something that underpins what you do, but it's also about having some clear objectives. What is it we want to achieve? Again, we often get into doing mode because the crisis has happened and we need to do things. But when we're thinking about how we're going to respond to when things happen, it's really important to look at what is it we want to achieve. What's the important element in that initial phase? And then what becomes more important as we develop. Because we start in broadcast mode because we have to tell people things, don't we? But we very quickly need to move it into a conversation, engaging with people and understanding. And that for me is why consultation, and I hate the word consultation, but I can't find a better one really. But understanding communities, understanding workforce, understanding people and how they can feed into what you're planning for communication becomes incredibly important. This for me it's like an underutilized thing. We tend to sit in the organization we're working for and do the planning. We might speak to the relevant people, the emergency planning team or whoever, but we rarely will go wider. And that I think means we lack a really diverse kind of overview. How will this work? How will this play out? I did talk, lots of you will know Shaoni Lynn, and I talked I think last year at one point about how you could use behavioural kind of change communications within crisis. And she at first in that conversation was like, I don't think you can, because you need to do all this kind of planning work to baseline and this, that, and the other for behavioral work. But then at the end, she was like, no, you absolutely can. This is the phase where we can do that, where we can look at what is it we want to achieve, where we can look at how we can engage with people, we can get that detail and that information. We've got to build in the empathy. It's one of my big things, as anybody will know. It's about getting that understanding. And I know now more than ever that I approach things from a perspective that I have. And I have to keep looking at making sure that I'm not used through my thought processes, through my kind of, the way I do problem solving. I'm not ignoring really important bits of information. Some really interesting stuff, if you're very boring like me, in the new book, where I look at decision making. Because I think for me, decision making is where our biases can really come out if we're not careful, if we're not alive to it, if we're not aware of it, and we don't kind of build processes that can help us, particularly when we're under pressure. So for me, this bit of being empathetic and having that built right the way through things really needs to start with the planning. But also too, another thing I'm really passionate about, which is the language we use. And what that says and how that engages with people. And I know from lots of work I've been doing over the last few years that, you only need to use one word out of place. And if you're not aware of the impact, that it might have on affected people from different places or particular groups, and you can massively undo all the good work that you may have got in place. It's a piece of work actually that we're working within the Emergency Planning Society with humanitarian awareness support. They've got a humanitarian group that works as well, and we're going to try and look at some guidance that we can pull together around processes to really check language and be aware of some of the elements of that, and also that language changes. But there's some other good stuff from Survivors Against Terror that they've done for journalists, which again I think is really helpful as a communicator to give you an indication of when you're in this crisis situation, things that you should be mindful of. So language really important. Inclusion I've talked about. Behavioural awareness I think I've covered. And ultimately you can start to, in this kind of planning phase, be human and build that humanity aspect into everything you do. Objectives, I could talk endlessly. I was doing some evaluation work yesterday, and I think when we're doing the planning for a crisis, we're very much in the tactical of, we need this to be here, we need that to be there. And I'm guilty of that as well when I've been doing work. You build a structural piece. But when we need to look at objectives, and we need to look at how we're going to evaluate, and we need to build that into that planning process. And when we're putting together a crisis comms plan, being clear of where are we at any point in time? Because if you're going to look at your impact, have you managed to achieve what you wanted to? The trust and confidence piece is really essential. And I know that, there's lots of data that people have. So we need to make sure we've got those baselines, and also have a clear idea of audiences. Who are they? Where are they? Unlike, I was listening to the budget before, ordinary people. I'm not sure I hate things. General public and ordinary people now should be abolished as terms that get used. But be clear on the audiences, and then we can start to look at what is it we want to achieve through this situation or through what's happening. What are the interventions that we're going to put in? And the new book's very much a prequel, I call it, which is all about how to deal with issues. And with issues management, you've always got this option. It's a bit like a game of chess, isn't it? If this happens, then I might do this. And if this happens, then this probably means we need to do X, Y, and Z. But look at those interventions that you're going to put in place and try and be as specific as you can about what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to achieve it. One of the big and kind of frustrations I have around social media in crisis is that people will go, we're going to do some social media as part of their crisis response. And it's just nowhere near going to cover how you're going to respond to disinformation, misinformation. How are you going to deal with people asking for what's going on? How are you going to monitor for incoming kind of messages that you need to respond to? It's a complex world, and you need to kind of be able to deal with that. So we need to know the scope in terms of what we've got access to. One of the big things for me is if you've got a customer service contact center, then you want to be working really closely with them. And in a crisis situation, I think it's a spanner that needs to really include that so that messaging can get to the right people, and data. What data is available at the moment? What does it show about where we are and what we're going to do?
Actually, the UK is better off in our growth numbers than France, Germany, Italy,
Is it
USA,
just? It's not just me.
Canada, Japan. We're going to show just before we let you go. This graph, which actually stands
just
in
on mute whilst
contrast to what
Amanda's
you've just
talking,
said.
please. That'd be really helpful.
Economic growth since COVID-19. I will tell you the figures of G7
It's a
countries.
crisis, isn't it,
United
Amanda?
States there at the top.
Just listening to COVID-19.
Yeah.
And then
Thanks,
ultimately,
Rob.
thank you. I was just getting sidetracked. Then ultimately, it's about the milestones, the journey. Where do you want to be at what point in time? And you can start to do this. It's link it to your scenario planning for what you're looking at, and look at where you want to be at what point in time. Everybody knows the key bits of evaluation. You can do this for crisis work. You should be doing it. We just tend to focus on the debrief elements, what worked, what didn't work, and blah, blah, blah. And for me, you know, use the AMEC stuff, let that take it through. If you're using the Oasis models, use that and help you to kind of identify how are we going to measure things. Totally measurable, but again, you know, as part of your dealing with a crisis, dealing with issues. For me, we've got to build all these things that you're always doing on a day-to-day basis into what we do. I'm conscious I probably will end up running over, so I'll try not to talk for too long. Talked as well about the building, and a lot of what happens, and I'm sure some of you will have seen this, which is a really interesting document. Lots of really useful stuff in there about how to look at behaviour in a crisis. For me, this taking a behavioural approach and looking at things is massively creative. It's a totally different kind of approach to looking at a crisis situation. It's not just something that you need to think about, because we tend to have thought about it as part of the health kind of background. I think there's huge elements where health, obviously behavioural change is a huge part of that, but it's part of everything, isn't it? It's part of a lot of what we do. And I'm a bit of an old school person that says, I think a lot of this we've been doing in terms of practically for a long time. You know, it's part of comms, isn't it? To change attitudes, to change behaviour. I think some of the science elements to it is we haven't been doing, and that's what we obviously why there's been a big push. But things to remember: a call to action. We do a call to action for crisis. We do a call for action to behavioural change. So that, again, you can see the links of how the two come together. You know, again, with the behavioural change, if you're going to look at it, it's about the clarity of what you're trying to do. How useful is it in terms of what you're trying to achieve, the accuracy of what you've got, the appropriateness. But ultimately, you're looking at being relevant and being useful and helping that situation move forward. So for me, I think in most situations, most crisis situations, there will be elements of behavioural change in whatever way that you may need to consider or think about. And again, that's part that needs to come into the planning phase. We need to look at that, and we need to look at how that might develop in terms of that central piece of responding once we've got past the initial something's happened. So if you haven't had a look at this, I definitely would recommend it. It gives you a good kind of insight to start to go, and where does this fit with our current plans, with our particular big risks, if you've got any particular issues that you're dealing with or that you're planning for. I also think I was trying to find, this is a rubbish picture, but I was trying to find a picture about when the dust settles, because there is a bit for me about that comes in that initial moment we talked about, the broadcast. We've got to tell people not to go away, not to do this, to stay at home, whatever it is, whatever we need to do that. That is that initial moment. Once that has passed, that's really starting to get where the dust settles. Doesn't mean the crisis has gone away. In fact, it means that the comms element becomes more important. It's when we can start to support people that are affected, is when we can start to put mechanisms in place to connect people back together. And I see comms really being, massive advocate, as you would imagine, not just because I work in comms, but we can have a huge impact when we're dealing with a crisis situation. It's why I feel as though, that's why in the new book I talk about issues management being something that we can't stop issues. They will develop, but we can help limit their impact, reduce them, and in some cases I still do think we can make them disappear. But it's recognizing it early enough and being able to respond. So we need to be clear about what we're trying to do. We need to use all our existing skills. Don't let all those creative skills, your design abilities, your video capacities, all those things are incredibly important. So all that creativity that you have within the team, once you get past that initial moment of crisis, you absolutely need to bring it into sharp focus. And connecting people back together. That's what I see it is. And that's why the behavioural change piece for me is really important now. As I said before, it's a journey and you're on a journey, and you can then look with some crises we're dealing with now. I think because of the state of the chaotic world we are in, they aren't going to disappear in a week. They aren't going to disappear in 2 weeks. I think we've got used over the years before COVID to very short term kind of situations. They might last a month, and then the initial impacts really lessen to a small group that we're there. We've seen with COVID, it can hit lots of people over a long, prolonged period of time. So we need to look at that on our kind of journey in terms of how we're developing our crisis response. And definitely for me, is it all rooted in the people element and engaging people, connecting people together, and building back consultation. I think this is a really stark headline because we see it with lots of things, but when there's pressure, when there's a crisis, it's always the people who are most vulnerable, I hate that word, whose situation gets worse. And again, what can we do to deal with that? How can we support that? And we absolutely need to be aware of that, because in the response that the organisation you're working for is making and the activity that they may put in place to deal with the crisis, we may actually make things worse for people. So again, how do we factor that into what we do? A couple of things in terms of consultation, I'd say, is are we reaching audiences that we need to, we want to? Are we making things worse through the communication? Have we factored in that we're making things as accessible as we can? Is our language inclusive? And apologies for anybody, I always use the example of Boris Johnson in his various kind of Latin and Greek gods and everything else that he uses. We need to keep it so that it's really understandable and accessible for everybody, not just for a few. And we can't forget people when we're responding to a crisis. And I have definitely been guilty of this in the past, that you keep looking from the organisation. You may be thinking about people, but have you actually gone, this is what we're planning to do? Tell us what you think. This is the way we're going to approach it. You can do it in the planning phase if you have the time, aware of that. But even if you're in the middle, you've had a crisis, you're dealing with the aftermath of it, you can definitely use those networks that you've got, those relationships that you have, and build in that consultation piece. So who does it well? I struggle to find examples, but I have to use, I'm not a big fan of Kentucky Fried Chicken. I'm vegan to start with. But anyway, Kentucky Fried Chicken, they got creative. There was a creative way that they used that which was a few years ago when they ran out of chicken. Yes, they did all the kind of traditional bits of crisis response, but they managed to use they used their brand kind of approach, which is quite humorous and quite light, but they still got a serious message through. And then I was trying to find something COVID-y. Apologies, I know there's some COVID entries in the unawards, so I tried to avoid anything that might look as though I was supporting any particular local authority. But that's creative for me. When you look at some of the things that went on and that we were involved in communicating through COVID, hugely creative. And again, how we can harness that now going forwards. Don't lose what you've learned for the last 2 years, because it'll massively improve how we respond to things. And just to make life simple, I tried to come up with top sort of 10 tips that I would have around sort of building creativity. The first thing is, in some way, try and give yourself some space to think, to have those ideas. And I know it's really problematic, but even if it's just over a brew somewhere, just try and give yourself a little bit of time just to think about things. Understand the impact, or try and understand the impact if you're in the planning phase of what is happening. Where is it hitting? Where's what am I needed to think about in terms of diversity and the kind of span of it, and also then that can start to feed into the ideas that you might want to kind of bring forward. Definitely move out that broadcast as soon as you can. As soon as you feel as though you've got all the urgent bits of information out, you want to be moving forward. Keep your objectives really clear and focused, and in a way that you can evaluate, so that you can look at certain points, particularly along a slightly longer running crisis. You can look at where you are, not just on what worked and what didn't work, but actually, has the messaging reached? Have we managed to achieve those objectives at this point in time? And always looking for opportunities. There's a huge amount of opportunities that come through the crisis and into the recovery phase. Networks for me, relationships, bring them into the fold when you're dealing with both the planning and with the response for a crisis. Those networks that you have on a daily basis or that you'll use when you're developing a campaign for something, massively beneficial to have those sorts of conversations around the approaches that you're thinking of taking and how you might develop things, and particularly being able to call on that when you're under pressure, I think is a real win. It's a real benefit. Also, don't forget this creativity. A lot of it, if I've talked about external, all for me the same with internal. We've got to be creative as well when we're looking at internal comms and how we're looking at connecting to staff, particularly when you're dealing with a pressured situation where the morale may be low before you even go into the crisis. So you've then got to kind of build through that. Comms is never going to encourage people to stay working for an organization if they're exhausted after dealing with a crisis. I was listening to them talking about people leaving work and various things in the budget, but you can help people deal with what's going on, so you can ease some of those pressures, or you can give them the right signposts for what they might need. Recovery takes time, and that time does give you the ability to build that creativity back in, to build in some different ways of doing things or to try different things. And to plan through recovery, I think, is essential, not just to fall from, well, we had a crisis, now we're not having a crisis, and then we're just kind of moving forward. We'll miss the learning, you miss those opportunities, and you've got to remember that when you've had a crisis, those people who have been in that crisis will have that in their minds for a long time, if not forever. So you've got to remember that when you're looking at how you build forward and how you go on after the crisis and the recovery is happened. And then I would say this again, because it's something I always say, is that you've got to test your initial response. Absolutely, we do that. A lot of people do that all the time. Test how you're going to deal with a crisis that goes on for any length of time. You can do it, trust me. There's lots of ways that we can talk about that do it. But also for me, you can also test that recovery phase. Test how are we going to move from crisis to recovery? What are the things we need to think through? You can do all that as part of your planning. What next? Oh, I would ask as a plea is always to review your plans, make sure they're up to date, make sure that you've thought through all the things that have come up over the last few years. If you haven't, I'm sure you've all been thinking about blackouts. I have as well. So, there's lots of factors how you're going to deal with not having any energy and not having any power for a period of time. That is those business continuity elements that can become important as well. So definitely keep a look on whether your plans are still as you would want them to be, should anything happen at any point in time. Check those relationships, understand your networks, how you can maximize them, how you can utilize them. I know lots of people already do this, but it's just having that in your mind when you might want to check things out or test an idea or get some initial feedback. Discuss those scenarios, whether that's with the team, whether that's with a number of people, or even with some of your contacts that you've got good relationships with. So you can then look at those steps that you might want to look to put in place along the way. Really keep focused on what those objectives are. What are your objectives in the initial phase? What are your objectives as things develop? And make sure that you're building that into your planning and developing. I would say update your training and make sure that you are training people in the right things. And again, we get new people joining teams. One of the first things we should be doing, as well as here's where everything is and here's all your colleagues, here's the vital bits of information you need to know. And one of them for me should always be, if we get a crisis, this is what happens. Because we can't just expect that they're going to absorb it along the way. And unfortunately for some people, will start work the week before something happens and then get catapulted into dealing with it. And look at these things as a focus for exercises, whether that's just as a tabletop discussion with a few of your colleagues, or whether that's a much bigger piece of work. You can build all these things into a kind of exercise regime. And I always say that I always please think about it before it happens. The more we can spend a little bit of time to be prepared, the less it's going to impact. Most importantly for me, less it's going to impact on your people. There's a massive uncertainty in the world. Having the plans and having a starting point, even if it's just a starting point, will definitely help the resilience within the team when something happens. It gives you somewhere to go from, and you're not trying to invent everything, in the middle of a kind of nightmare situation. So you've got that starting point, and you can get people trained and ready and build their resilience for the inevitable when it happens. Very quickly, a couple of plugs. I've started to do, because I'm conscious people's training budgets are getting like squeezed beyond belief. Crisis comms exercises. The first one, which I've kept them really affordable and really tight to about 10 people. First one is on the 1st of December. I'm going to do a couple more next year. If you're interested, just message me, and I'll send you some details so you've got an idea. It's going to be 2 hours to go. You're in the hot seat for this situation. What are you doing? What are you thinking about? And having some discussions. So it should be good. Should be good fun. Should I say that? Good fun. It should be entertaining. And also, because we've done a little bit of plugging of the book, and I've got 2 books. The first one, Crisis Comm Strategies, which came out a couple of years ago, and then the one that's come out the other week. There are 2 different discount codes. So if you go on the Kogan page of the publisher's website, you need to know those codes, but they're there. And you'll get a 20% discount, because I'm very grateful for you mentioning the book along the way. And I do other stuff as well. If you are interested in crisis comms, I'm a bit obsessed. So I do a monthly case study, and I also do a kind of fortnightly-ish newsletter. And then every so often I'll do bits and pieces like the blackout guide that I've sent around a few people. Some thoughts on communication for people affected by blackouts and things we need to get prepared, but also as communicators, what we need to think about. So always try and share those through social and all the rest of it. And Darren, I don't know how long I've taken there, but if there's any questions, I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Well, you said it would take 30 minutes, Amanda, and you've been exactly 30 minutes. So what a pro you are. Yeah, that was so interesting and helpful. I suppose one of the quick reflections is that actually a lot of the things that you've gone through there, be it the preparation, the evaluation, etc., a lot of it is akin to a normal comm strategy, isn't it? But actually, organisations, when a crisis hit, can just go into pandemonium, can't they? And we actually forget some of the basics. So I think there's some really timely reminders and some useful takeouts there. I've got a couple of questions, and then please get your questions into the chat. Helena's going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll pitch your questions to Amanda. So get furiously typing into the chat right now if you can. I suppose just a couple of really quick ones from me to get us up and running. Very often, crises land first on social media, don't they? Generally on Twitter, and then they work their way through to the other platforms. How can we be creative with social media still, given that the current landscape of social media can be quite tricky to navigate at the best of times? But any kind of top tips really on social media and that crisis landing?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is to have the right monitoring in place, so that as soon as you get a hint that something's happening, whether that's a one-off post that's a problem, or whether that's a trend that starts to emerge, that's the other difficult thing. You need to have the right kind of monitoring in place so that you get that early alert. I think once you've got that, you can be on the proactive, you can be on the front foot with some of this. It is a bit of a lion's den. It is a difficult landscape. I am not a social media expert. There are people who absolutely are. You will have people in your teams who are social media whizzes. They will understand how to navigate through that. So I would harness their expertise in delivering that. But I mean, the key bit though is that initial understanding. Get that early alert so that you can be more a bit more kind of, I suppose, creative or whatever else if you're on the front foot, because you're then seen to be one putting the information out rather than being in a reactive mode. but I think it's something that you really need to think really carefully about. I think, you know, something would be said, absolutely, this isn't rocket science, and a lot of what I've talked about is things you'll do on a day-to-day basis. You know, stakeholder maps that you've got absolutely come into their own when you're dealing with a crisis. But also you've got the issue for me when you've got with social media. How are you going to respond to misinformation and disinformation? And you can't ignore that anymore because it's such a key part. And yet it's really problematic. So for me, you know, the plans need to include some of those things as well. I've got no easy answer to the social media thing other than be really prepared and use the experts that can go, you know, can be a bit more creative.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, Amanda. I suppose the second one that jumps out for me is that lots of colleagues on the call today will already have crisis comms plans in place, and that's great. Actually, then what we've seen, haven't we, there's loads of examples of this, is when the crisis does hit an organisation, they kind of forget that there's already a crisis comms plan in place, and nobody thinks to look at it for the first 48 hours. And, you know, it's not criticism, it's a difficult situation, but I suppose any top tips. So once you've got your well-crafted crisis comms plan, how do we make sure that it gets used in the event of that crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a couple of things. If you're not looking at it because you know it so well, you've trained through it so well, then that's great, because you don't necessarily need to look at that initial kind of moments. You need to then look at how that develops over the next sort of 24, 48 hours or even longer. But if it's because you then go, oh, we didn't know, you know, we don't know we've got a plan, or we don't, then it's about really understanding it, testing it, and making sure it becomes second nature to go, I'm going to have a look at the plan. What was in the plan? Make the plan work for you. That's the other thing as well. Have you got things in like checklists, which people will find incredibly useful, because it's that reminder of, have I done all these things? So I think sometimes we need to make those kind of plans and things we have in place work for us, rather than it being something for the organisation that ticks a box. But yeah, I do think, as I say, we've got to get much better at making sure people understand it. If they're new into the organisation, if they're new into that comms team, if something's changed, then test that plan out, make sure they've lived it and understand how it works. I should say, I always got, like, I know a guy who worked in American government, and there was a full on pandemic plan, comms and everything, that the US government had, and Donald Trump just ripped it up and went, we'll do it our own way. After years of them planning for it. So that
Oh, you froze there for me a little bit there, Amanda, at the end. But yeah, so top tip: don't vote for people like Donald Trump in the first place. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you can't budget about having somebody like Donald Trump rip your plans up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So shall we dive across to Helena? Have we got any questions in the chat, Helena, that we can pose to Amanda?
Yeah, we've got a few that have come in already. Thanks for your questions, everybody. Keep them coming. There's a couple of related ones about senior leadership in the organisation. How do you get them to be creative, but also stop them being quite so risk averse? You know, leadership has been criticised recently about prioritising reputation management instead of being genuine and just offering up an apology. So the two questions really are, how could we persuade leaders to be honest, say how we could have done things better, and rather than go on the defensive, and then stop them being so risk averse and with that mentality, and encourage them to let us be creative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts in your day-to-day, is building that confidence in everything that you do, so that when you get under the pressure situation, there's a level of confidence there already is, so that you can perhaps push the boundaries a little bit. I think the other thing I often think is, we deal in lots of crisis situations with legal advice, and lawyers go in with case law, and we need to go in with case studies. So we need to be able to go in and go, have you seen how this worked over here? This is how we could operate. This is what we need to do. And there's lots of opportunities to kind of to do that. I also understand it from the leadership perspective. You know, they're potentially going to lose their job. That's the bottom line, isn't it? If you're a leader that's in an organisation that has failed in some way, or some way contributed to the fact that this crisis has emerged, or has done a poor response, it's effectively your livelihood. So we've got to try and find a way to depersonalize them from it a little bit, and then look at the bigger picture. I think the issue of reputation management is really in sharp focus, and I know that from personal experience from the even with the arena and the report that came out a couple of weeks ago. I had no knowledge about some of the elements of that until that inquiry happened, which is just ridiculous, and it shouldn't be the case. I think things like, I know there's some NHS colleagues on here, duty of candour, things like that exist. You'll see more and more of that happening, and it'll be our duty in terms of our communications and ethical response to say, this is being dishonest, or this isn't portraying the position we need to be in. And I think it's about always taking it back to, if you don't focus on the people elements and you focus on reputation, then you will get judged poorly, whatever you do, because first thing anybody's going to look at is how were the people treated around this. And we see that every time. Next time there's any kind of sort of vague crisis or issue, look at it, because every time anybody talks about it in any capacity, it's about the people elements. So those are the bits I think we've got to keep pushing back. We can do it in the planning phase, we can keep talking them through that, but I think with a level of sympathy in that, a lot for a lot of senior leaders, that crisis will be the beginning or the end for them, and we've got to kind of get them confident through that, and confident with the way they need to approach it. And it's that kind of communication training in its widest sense that becomes important. But it's a long path. I'm not suggesting that any of this is really easy at all. But you'll be doing it on a day-to-day anyway. Build on that COVID. There'll be a wave of love that you had after COVID, where everybody saw what comms did. Don't let that disappear, because that's useful to feed back in at key points.
That's really helpful. Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Helena, we've got more questions from our colleagues.
Yep, we've got one that Carol sent in advance, and that was about creativity in advance, and how being creative with the comms planning could help avert a crisis before they happen, prevent them happening. We're used to dealing with the crises and the responding, but what can we do as a warm-up to try and prevent them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difficulty. Sometimes things happen and we can't have prevented them. They're like, I'm not going to use the term natural disasters, because, but there'll be a situation that we could not foresee. Extreme weather and things like that, sometimes we can't stop them happening. But there are some bits that we can, when we've got issues that are emerging, when there's a reputational situation. I think the key bit to start with is to understand your risks. I'm very keen on, risk communication is a whole different other conversation. But if you understand the risks that are impacting on the business, if you understand the risks that there's a concern about, then you can start to look at what you may need to do on a day-to-day basis, and sort of factor that into your everyday communications and what you're involved with. And I think that for me is where you can kind of get kind of creative in advance, because you can start to look at what are those big risks? What might that mean? What could we do today and tomorrow that might put us in a good position for if that happens? So if it might stop it happening, you might then be in a position where you're able to limit the impact it has because of some groundwork that you've done. We'll do some of this on a day-to-day basis anyway. I'm sure people have had that. You can see there's a big sticky thing, 5-6 months on the horizon, and you start, if you've got the time and you're able to, you start to do some preparation work to sort of get people used to the idea that something is going to emerge. And so I think you can do that a lot around that planning phase, and trying to tackle some of the risks.
Thanks, Amanda.
And if Carol, if that doesn't answer it, then she can tell me, because I can see her.
She's giving you a thumbs up, so it must do. Sarah asked a quick one during the chat, and that was just while you were presenting it, was just referring back to the reference on language, the use of language during a crisis, and just sort of, she didn't quite catch it, but what was that bit about the use of language? What did you refer to there?
Yeah, there's a few things. If you're interested in terms of the impact of language, there's some useful stuff that the Survivors Against Terror have already been doing with journalists. And also the Peace Foundation in Warrington have done some things in the past. I think the issue is how we use some of that kind of element to help communicators, and that's the piece that with the communications group of the Emergency Planning Society, and then there's a humanitarian kind of response group. We're going to come together to try and pull some guidance that we think would be useful, because you can't say use this word, don't use that word, because it very much depends on a lot of circumstances. But what we're trying to do is give you sort of a framework for what to consider, how to consider it, so that it will hopefully help people in dealing with that. I think you can't kind of overestimate the importance of just the wording. There's a huge thing about not using the word vulnerable. I found myself doing that, which is why I pulled myself up before, and making sure we don't do that. I rarely talk about victims, because again it brings with it a whole kind of subjectivity, and rather I talk about affected people, because who's a victim and who's not. And then I think for us, we often are the ones producing the text, the statements for the media. We can get ahead of even the media needing to do it, and start to use better terminology. So yeah, Sarah, I hope that helps. Good.
She's given us some thumbs up, so I think it does. Leanne asked a bit of a meaty one about artificial intelligence. So how should we plan for the increased use of AI in our crisis comms planning? So she's thinking in relation to the spread of misinformation and disinformation, particularly when dealing with a crisis. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge area. There is actually a lot of ways we're already dealing with artificial intelligence anyway. We just don't kind of badge it as that. And what you are on a difficult one. If we put the misinformation, disinformation to one side, I think artificial intelligence, you can look at what it can bring you in terms of automating some of the things you might need to do. I'm always a bit cautious. Again, I think it was Kentucky Fried Chicken the other week, wasn't it, with their promotion that was linked to people are nodding, you'll know what I mean. That is for me when things go, we have problems with it. So there is a huge level of sentiment, feelings, moods that at the moment artificial intelligence can't deal with. So I'm always fighting shy in a crisis situation of automating too much, because I think you might lose some of that sensitivity to what's happening. But I think in terms of misinformation and disinformation, there's two things. The difference between the two, and I'm sorry if people know this and I'm saying, but I always think it's useful to point out, is the intent. So misinformation, there's no intent. It's just erroneous. It's just, people putting things out that are inaccurate and they don't realise. Disinformation is the bit we need to focus on, because that's the deliberate attempt to undermine what you're doing. Are there any easy ways of doing it? Put simply, really, it's about recognizing the trends. What are the rumors? What is the speculation that's coming up? Make yourself the trusted voice and keep using every possible channel and avenue to tackle it, to keep, restating the case. And if you can do that in an automated way, sometimes through social, then that's great. Always with those checks and balances, though, because I have a massive concern about creating additional problems. But that's the key bit, is making sure that you're continuing to put the correct situation out, that you're challenging the inaccuracies. And if you can do that using AI, then great. I think we'll see more tools and things coming in the future that'll help with some of this as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Do you want me to come in with another one there, Darren? Or have you got someone?
I have, but you go for it, Helena.
Well, I was just going to say that Jen had asked quite an open question, really, about if you've got any more examples of what you count as creative when it comes to comms.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we think, oh, it's got to be like this fantastic thing, and really kind of like whizzy. For creativity, for me, is really just looking at what you're trying to achieve, developing, things in a perhaps slightly beyond the here's a press release about what's happened situation. So I'm quite broad with how I look at creativity. I think lots of you'll be doing it on a day-to-day basis in lots of different ways, dealing with issues, but you might not see it in that way. I think the big challenge is making sure you build that space for dealing with, particular crises that may be coming, to think things through. But I'm thinking about, what are the ways you can innovate? How could you use different tools? What tools have you perhaps used in a certain respect that you could do more with? How could you use, particularly for me, I think underused with crisis is visuals, video and photographs and various other things, because we tend to want to get the kind of words out about what's happened. But then there's a whole thing about imagery and how we can use that to kind of help. And even like with those examples around COVID, you will have getting something that's eye-catching and interesting and going to engage people, particularly as the kind of time goes on and people become weary. I think that's where I see the sort of creative space putting in, but it doesn't need to be all singing, all dancing. It's just about looking at it perhaps in a different way, and trying something a bit different.
I got a thank you in the chat there from Jen, so good stuff.
Thank you.
Kelly's asked a good question about creative tips on supporting staff before, during and after a crisis, but where their actions have inadvertently caused the issue. So the media have covered it, there's intense interest from both internal and external audiences, but she's thinking specific more on the less serious end of the crisis scale.
Yeah, I think there's a huge thing about the kind of duty of care element. So what can an organisation do to kind of wrap around that individual, and give them that support, give them that advice? How can they deal with what's happening? We've got to remember that often with staff, they don't understand how social media and the media and everything's going to operate. So that with that lack of knowledge, it makes things worse because it takes away some of the elements of feeling as though you can do things to manage, not necessarily control, but manage the situation. So I think it's about us coming in with that kind of advice around them as an individual, even if it is, just to how to set the Facebook privacy notices or whatever. There's a whole range of things that you will know because you do it on a day-to-day, but that member of staff may not. So I think we need to look around that. And then also, what are the ways that we can talk to the media or talk to other people, and try and not just offer that support, but try and limit that impact. You've got to remember, in the same way that everybody's aware of the mental kind of health situation, so are the media. The media are well aware of the impact. It might not always stop them doing things to cause problems or to add to problems. But if you can kind of raise some of those issues around kind of the impact of what's happened, that it's having on a whole team, not just a member of staff, then hopefully you might be able to sort of start to get some management around the situation. I think it's a really important question to raise though, because for me, the way we support staff on all fronts when we're dealing with a crisis or we're dealing with an issue or any kind of situation is really important. But I think the first thing is around what good advice can we give them to put them in the right position. And sometimes it has been in the past for me, and even more recently dealing with clients, that they need to just go away for a week and let things settle, come back, and then they can kind of start to move forward. But you've got to look at it over a period of time as well. Sometimes, even for some small things, it's about just trying to, take the sting out of the situation, and then help them back to the workplace, and to move forward. But really important, I think that you've got a lot to add as a comms professional to HR and other people who may be also supporting around that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amanda. And I guess just half an eye on the clock. We've got about 3 minutes left. So I suppose the question we kind of posed, wasn't it, is what part does creativity play in crisis comms? And it plays a lot, doesn't it, all the way through all the stages and kind of the 5-stage process that you kind of set out at the start. It plays a massive part. And having just looked through some of the other awards entries in the crisis comms category, we've both taken a look at those, haven't we? And it's really clear that creativity does run through the very best work. So yeah, you've kind of answered the question really nicely today. Christmas is coming. For any person on the call looking to buy a comms palette present, one of Amanda's 2 books might be quite handy. Obviously, there's a 20% discount code, which is handy as well. I noticed with the new book, Amanda, you described it as the prequel. Do you think there's like an order that people should read the 2 books in? Is the one that they should perhaps get first, or does it not matter?
No, it doesn't matter. I suppose it depends on where you feel you have the most need. So if you feel as though in terms of a full-blown crisis that you just want to check everything, you want to feel comfortable, then I would go there. I call it the prequel because, yeah, it is very much around how do you stop issues that you're managing developing into a crisis. So if you feel as though the issues element is where you might need to do some focus, then I would look at that. But no, I think I would hope they stand independently. But I like to call it a prequel because it is all about the bits that happen before the crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. Thanks, Amanda. So we're pretty much on time. So could I thank Amanda for giving up her time? I found that personally really useful. Hopefully others on the call have as well. I think we can share all of Amanda's contact details if you need her for anything afterwards. We will do that. I'll share a copy of Amanda's slides. We'll get the recording out to people as well. Big thanks to Helena for helping me host today and for pitching all the questions and for looking after the chat. That's super helpful. Thank you, Helena, for that. And thanks to everybody for taking an hour out of your busy afternoons to join in. I hope it's been useful. If you've got other suggestions for future episodes of Creativity Lab, I'm all ears, so just shout, whether it's somebody you'd like to hear from or it's a particular subject matter, just drop me an email or drop me a tweet, and always happy to host more of these. So yeah, thanks everybody. It's 3 o'clock, so go and make yourself a fresh drink, go and get a nice biscuit of choice and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks all, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.